The Europeans had Neanderthal DNA woven into their immune systems and their skin. The East Asians had Denisovan DNA, giving them adaptations to high altitude. The Pacific Islanders carried more Denisovan ancestry than anyone else on the planet. None of them was pure. All of them were mixed. And every difference between them, every visible trait, every regional variation was the product of a much older and much more complicated story than the textbooks had ever told. So, what does this mean for how we think about ourselves and each other? It means that the categories we have inherited, the ways we have been taught to divide humanity into types and races and tribes, are surface phenomena. They are real in the sense that they have shaped history and culture and the ways that societies have organized themselves, but they do not reflect the deeper genetic reality. That reality is shared. That reality is mixed. That reality is a story of contact and exchange that goes back hundreds of thousands of years and involves species that no longer exist. When you look in the mirror, you are not looking at a pure descendant of any single ancestral population. You are looking at the result of dozens of mixing events, the genetic legacy of Neanderthals or Denisovans or ghost species in Africa, the inheritance of migrations that crossed continents and oceans, the slow accumulation of changes over thousands of generations. Every human being on Earth is a walking archive of ancient history, and the history that we carry in our cells is one of constant motion, constant contact, and constant transformation. The scientists who compared white DNA to African DNA in 2010 expected to confirm what they already believed. Instead, they opened a door to a much stranger and much richer story. A story where the boundaries between species were never as fixed as we thought. A story where every population on Earth is the product of countless ancient encounters. A story where the categories we use to divide ourselves dissolve the moment you look closely at the genetic code. We are not separate. We are not pure. We are the children of 100,000 mixing events stretching back into a deep past that we are only just beginning to understand. And every new bone fragment, every new genome sequenced, every new ancient cave excavated adds another layer to the story. The textbooks are being rewritten in real time. The clean narrative of human origins is gone. What has replaced it is something more interesting and more complex and more humbling. We are all in the Ag. Scientists have done something remarkable. They have started identifying which specific Neanderthal and Denisovan genes are still active in modern human bodies and what those genes actually do. The results are sometimes beautiful, sometimes troubling, and almost always surprising. Take the immune system. A gene called STAT2, inherited from Neanderthals, helps modern humans fight off certain viral infections. People who carry the Neanderthal version of this gene have stronger immune responses to viruses like influenza. When the modern human ancestors of Europeans and Asians left Africa, they walked into a continent full of pathogens that their ancestors had never encountered. Neanderthals had been living in those environments for hundreds of thousands of years, and their immune systems had adapted accordingly. By interbreeding with Neanderthals, modern humans inherited those immune adaptations almost overnight in evolutionary terms. It was a genetic shortcut. Instead of waiting tens of thousands of years for new mutations to develop, modern humans simply borrowed the Neanderthal versions and integrated them into their own genomes. The same thing happened in Asia with Denisovan genes. Different pathogens, different adaptations, but the same basic process. Cross-species interbreeding turned out to be one of the most powerful tools that early modern humans had for adapting to new environments. look completely different on the outside can be more closely related genetically than two people who look identical. It happens all the time. The visible differences between populations are real, but they are surface adaptations to local environments. They sit on top of a genome that is overwhelmingly shared between all humans on Earth. How shared? Around 99.9% of the human genome is identical across every population on the planet. Out of 3 billion DNA base pairs, only about 3 million vary between any two random humans. And of that 3 million, the vast majority of variation is found within populations, not between them. A randomly selected European has more genetic variation when compared to another European than to a randomly selected African. The categories of race that we use in everyday conversation do not map onto the underlying biology in any meaningful way. They are useful for sociology. They are useful for understanding history and culture and the ways that human societies have organized themselves. But they are not useful for understanding ancestry, because ancestry, real ancestry, the kind written in your DNA, does not respect those boundaries. Your great-great-great-grandfather might have been someone you would not have recognized as belonging to your tribe, your community, your race. Push back further and the categories dissolve completely. Push back to 20,000 years ago, and your ancestors were hunter-gatherers in places you have never been, speaking languages that no longer exist, looking nothing like the populations that now occupy those regions. This brings us to one of the most surprising findings of the last decade: the genetic history of Asia. For a long time, the assumption was that Asia had been populated in a single wave, that the ancestors of modern East, Asians had walked across Central Asia tens of thousands of years ago and gradually filled the continent. The reality is much stranger. Asia was actually populated in multiple waves by multiple distinct populations who arrived at different times and from different directions. The first wave came around 50,000 years ago, hugging the southern coast of Asia and pushing all the way to Australia. These people were the ancestors of modern Australian Aboriginal populations and many of the indigenous groups of Southeast Asia. They carried high levels of Denisovan ancestry, and their genetic signature is still found across the Pacific. The second wave came later, perhaps 30 to 40,000 years ago, and it pushed into northern Asia, eventually crossing the Bering land bridge into the Americas. These people were the ancestors of most modern East Asians and Native Americans. They carried Neanderthal and some Denisovan ancestry, but in different proportions than the first wave. Then there was a third wave, much more recent, associated with the spread of agriculture out of the river valleys of China. This wave reshaped the genetic map of East Asia within the last 10,000 years, replacing or absorbing earlier populations across vast regions. The Han Chinese, who today form the largest ethnic group on Earth, carry the genetic legacy of all three waves. So do Japanese populations, Korean populations, and the various peoples of Southeast Asia. Each population is a unique blend of these ancient migrations mixed in, different proportions shaped by different local histories. And then there is the strangest finding of all. In 2018, scientists analyzing a tiny bone fragment from the Denisova cave, the same cave where the original Denisovan finger bone was found, made a discovery that nobody had predicted. The bone belonged to a young girl who had lived around 90,000 years ago. When they sequenced her DNA, they found that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid, the direct child of two different hominid species. Her existence proved that Neanderthals and Denisovans, two species that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years, were still mating with each other and producing viable offspring deep into the last ice age. And if Neanderthals and Denisovans were interbreeding, and modern humans were also interbreeding with both of them, then the picture of human evolution becomes something almost impossible to describe in simple terms. It is not a tree with branches. It is a tangled web. Different populations diverged, came back together, mixed, separated again, mixed with new populations they encountered, and slowly merged into the genetic patchwork that defines every human alive today. There is no pure line. There is no original population that survived intact. Every group that exists now is the product of countless ancient encounters, some of them between species that we used to think could never have produced offspring at all. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed they understood human ancestry. The story was clean. The story was simple. Modern humans evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago, walked out of the continent roughly 60,000 years ago, and slowly populated the rest of the world. Everyone alive today, every person on every continent, descended from that single African migration. The textbooks were written, the case was closed. And then, in 2010, a team of geneticists in Leipzig, Germany, did something nobody had ever done before. They sequenced the complete genome of a Neanderthal from a 40,000-year-old bone fragment. And they compared it to the DNA of living humans across every continent. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about who we are. The Africans tested had almost no Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. But the Europeans, the Asians, the Native Americans, every single non-African population tested carried between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA woven into their cells. However, this was just the surface of the discovery. As the data poured in over the next decade, scientists realized that the genetic story of humanity was not one migration, not one mixing event, but dozens of them, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. And some of the populations involved were not even the same species. If you find this topic fascinating, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig into the genetics, the ancient migrations, and the buried history of human ancestry every week. To understand why this discovery shook the field, you have to understand what scientists believed before it. The dominant theory was called out of Africa, and it stated that all anatomically modern humans evolved in East Africa, then spread across the planet in a single wave, replacing every other hominid species they encountered. Neanderthals in Europe, Homo erectus in Asia. They were all wiped out, the theory said, either through competition or violence, or simple bad luck. There was no interbreeding, no mixing. The replacement was total. This idea dominated anthropology for 40 years. It appeared in every textbook. It was taught in every university, and it turned out to be wrong. The first crack came when scientists at the Max Planck Institute, led by Svante Pääbo, managed to extract DNA from Neanderthal bones found in a cave in Croatia. Getting ancient DNA out of bones that old was considered nearly impossible. Most of the genetic material had degraded into useless fragments, but Pääbo and his team developed new techniques sequencing the bones piece by piece, reconstructing the Neanderthal genome from millions of tiny shards of code. When they finished, they had something no scientist had ever held before. A complete genetic blueprint of an extinct human species. Then they did the comparison. They lined up the Neanderthal genome against the genomes of 5 living humans, 2 from Africa, 3 from outside Africa. The Africans showed almost zero overlap with Neanderthal DNA. The non-Africans showed something else entirely. Specific stretches of their genomes, segments that were unmistakably Neanderthal, embedded permanently in their genetic code. The implications were staggering. It meant that somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, when modern humans left Africa and pushed into Eurasia, they did not just replace the Neanderthals they encountered. They mated with them. The two species, which had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years and developed different physical traits, different brain structures, different immune systems, came back together and produced offspring. Those offspring survived. Their children survived. And every European, every East Asian, every Native American alive today carries the genetic fingerprint of that ancient encounter. But the story did not stop with Neanderthals. In 2008, Russian archaeologists working in a remote cave in the Altai mountains of Siberia found a finger bone. It was small, about the size of a child's pinky, and it had been buried in the cave floor for at least 40,000 years. The bone was sent to the same Leipzig that had sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and when the results came back, the scientists could not believe what they were reading. The DNA did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals either. It was something else, a third hominid species, previously unknown, that had lived alongside humans and Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years. They named the new species Denisovans, after the cave where the bone was found. And when researchers compared the Denisovan genome to living human populations, they found something even stranger than the Neanderthal results. People from Papua New Guinea, Australia, the Philippines, and parts of Indonesia carried up to 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes. Some isolated populations in Tibet showed even higher percentages. East Asians, including Han Chinese, Yumien, Kuchong, Cambodia, Ujing, Japanese, and Koreans, also carried Denisovan ancestry, though at lower levels. The geographic pattern made no sense at first. Denisovans had only been found in one cave in Siberia. How could populations in Australia and Papua New Guinea, 10,000 kilometers away, carry so much of their DNA? The answer reshaped our understanding of ancient migration. Denisovans must have ranged across enormous swaths of Asia. They must have lived in jungles and deserts and coastal regions. And when modern humans pushed eastward out of Africa, they ran into Denisovan populations not just once, but multiple times, in multiple locations, over thousands of years. Each encounter left a genetic mark. The closer you trace human populations to Australia and the Pacific Islands, the higher the Denisovan percentage climbs. It is not random noise. It is the genetic record of a forgotten species that once ruled half a continent. And here is where things get even more interesting. When scientists looked at specific Denisovan genes that survived in modern populations, they found something remarkable. The Tibetan ability to live at extreme high altitudes, where oxygen levels are dangerously low for most humans, comes from a Denisovan gene called EPAS1. When modern humans interbred with Denisovans, they picked up a genetic adaptation that allowed them to thrive in the thin air of the Himalayas. Without that ancient mixing event, modern Tibetans could not live where they live. The same is true for certain immune system genes in East Asians and Pacific Islanders. They were inherited from Denisovans and Neanderthals. And they helped early modern humans survive diseases that their African ancestors had never encountered. Meanwhile, in Africa, a different but equally surprising story was unfolding. For decades, scientists had assumed that African populations were the cleanest example of pure modern human ancestry. They had stayed on the continent. They had not encountered Neanderthals or Denisovans. Their DNA, the thinking went, was a direct line back to the original Homo sapiens population. But in 2016, geneticists analyzing the genomes of West African populations, particularly the Yoruba and Mende, found something that did not fit the model. There were strange segments of DNA in their genomes, segments that did not match any known modern human population, segments that were too old, too divergent, to come from any ancestor that anthropologists had identified. The conclusion was inescapable. Africa had its own ancient hominid populations, separate from Neanderthals and Denisovans, and modern humans on the continent had interbred with them. The ghost population, as scientists started calling it, has never been found in the fossil record. No bones have been identified, no skulls, no teeth. But its genetic signature is unmistakable in the DNA of millions of West Africans alive today. Some estimates suggest that up to 19% of the Yoruba genome comes from this unknown ancient species. That is significantly more than the Neanderthal percentage in Europeans. And it means that the genetic story of Africa is not simpler than the story of Eurasia. It is more complex. There were at least 2 and possibly 3 different hominid species mixing on the African continent for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans even existed. So when scientists compared white DNA to African DNA, what they found was not what anyone expected. They found that every single human population on Earth, without exception, carries the genetic fingerprints of multiple ancient species. Europeans carry Neanderthal DNA. East Asians carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. Pacific Islanders carry the highest Denisovan percentages on the planet. Africans carry DNA from a mysterious ghost species that has never been found. Native Americans carry traces from all of these mixing events, having inherited the genetic legacy of every population that came before them. The clean, simple story of human evolution turned out to be neither clean nor simple. It is messy, it is layered, it involves dozens of populations, multiple species, and tens of thousands of years of contact and exchange. The boundaries between species, which biologists once thought were absolute, were actually porous. When 2 hominid populations met, they mated, they produced children. Those children were sometimes infertile, like mules, but often they were not. They survived, they reproduced, and their genes spread through both parent populations, carrying traits and adaptations across what should have been impassable biological barriers. The implications for how we think about race and ancestry are profound. The traditional categories that humans have used for centuries, the divisions between European, African, Asian, the divisions between white and black, the divisions between the so-called races, are not biological realities. They are cultural constructions built on top of a genetic reality that is far more interesting and far more interconnected than anyone realized. Take skin color, for example. For most of recorded history, people assumed that skin color was a fundamental marker